You've seen the movies, explosions, heroic charges, dramatic last stands, heroes charging into battle, bullets flying, history being made in slow motion. But here's the truth nobody tells you. Most of World War II was just waiting. Soldiers spent the vast majority of their time not fighting at all. In fact, historians estimate that for every hour of actual combat, soldiers spent dozens of hours doing absolutely nothing. So, what did they actually do between battles? The answer is stranger, funnier, and darker than you'd expect. Let's find out. The number one complaint from soldiers across every army wasn't the enemy. It wasn't the cold, the mud, or even the food. It was boredom. Pure, suffocating, endless boredom. The military even had a saying for it. Hurry up and wait. You'd get an urgent order, sprint to a new position, set everything up as fast as possible, and then nothing. No orders, no enemy, no action, just you, your rifle, and a whole lot of time for days, sometimes weeks. One American soldier wrote home saying, and I quote, "The war is 90% waiting and 10% sheer terror. Soldiers would do almost anything to pass the time. They gambled, constantly. Card games, dice, betting on literally anything they could think of. One group of British soldiers became so desperate for entertainment that they started betting on which raindrop would reach the bottom of a window first. They would press their faces against the glass and argue passionately about raindrops. That's how bored they were. They also wrote letters home. Enormous quantities of letters, so many that the postal system nearly collapsed under the weight of them. The U.S. Army alone moved over 2.5 billion pieces of mail during the war. 2.5 billion. Entire teams of soldiers were dedicated to nothing but sorting and delivering mail because receiving a letter from home was one of the few things that could genuinely lift a soldier's spirits. They also read whatever they could find. Novels, magazines, newspapers, instruction manuals. Anything with words on it. The American military actually created a special series of pocket-sized books specifically for soldiers called Armed Services Editions. These were small enough to fit in a uniform pocket and tough enough to survive field conditions. Over 120 million copies were distributed to troops throughout the war. Reading became one of the most popular and surprisingly important activities in every army. Now, if there's one thing soldiers talked about more than home, more than their families, more than winning the war, it was food. And for very good reason. Military food was notoriously, legendarily, almost impressively terrible. The standard U.S. ration was called the K ration. It came in a small wax-coated cardboard box designed to survive almost any conditions. Inside you would find a canned meat product, some crackers, a small chocolate bar, instant coffee, and cigarettes. Soldiers absolutely hated it. They especially hated the canned meat, which they nicknamed mystery meat, because nobody was quite sure what animal it had originally come from. The cans were labeled simply as meat product, which didn't exactly inspire confidence. German soldiers weren't much better off. Their diet consisted largely of black bread, canned sardines, and something called Erbswurst, which was essentially a sausage made of dried peas pressed into the shape of a sausage. It tasted exactly as bad as it sounds. Soviet soldiers arguably had it the worst of all. Their standard field ration was often nothing more than hard biscuits and a small amount of sugar. Just biscuits and sugar, that was it. So you can imagine why, whenever soldiers got anywhere near a town or village, the first thing on their minds was finding real food. Trading with local civilians became extremely common across every front of the war. A single pack of American cigarettes could get you an entire home-cooked meal in France. Chocolate bars were practically currency in Italy. Some soldiers became surprisingly skilled cooks, improvising meals from whatever ingredients they could find or trade for, and turning military rations into something that was at least recognizable as food. With so much time on their hands and very little else to do, soldiers got surprisingly creative. Many took up art, sketching, painting, even sculpting from whatever materials happened to be available. Some of the most moving and historically significant artwork of the 20th century was created in foxholes, barracks, and military camps. German soldiers in particular became known for carving intricate objects out of wood. Chess sets, small figurines, decorative boxes, toys for children back home. They would work on these carvings for weeks, sending them back as gifts to their families. Soldiers also discovered or rediscovered a love of music. Harmonicas became incredibly popular across all armies because they were small enough to fit in a pocket and tough enough to survive almost any conditions. Entire informal bands formed spontaneously in camps, playing jazz, folk songs, classical pieces, anything the soldiers knew how to play. There are photographs from almost every theater of the war showing groups of soldiers gathered around someone playing guitar or harmonica, singing together. One of the stranger hobbies that emerged was collecting enemy equipment. Soldiers would actively seek out and trade helmets, badges, belt buckles, and uniform buttons from the opposing side. Some collections became so large and heavy that soldiers needed an entire extra bag just to carry them alongside their regular kit. Soldiers also organized competitions and sporting events whenever the situation allowed. Boxing matches were especially popular in the American Army, with soldiers gathering from miles around to watch and bet on the outcome. But it wasn't all card games, harmonicas, and boxing matches. The waiting had a genuinely dark side that is rarely talked about. The anticipation of battle, knowing that fighting was coming but having absolutely no idea when, was psychologically devastating in ways that are hard to fully appreciate today. Soldiers called it simply the fear. Not fear of a specific thing, but a constant, low-level, never-ending anxiety that sat in the stomach like a stone and never fully went away. Even during the quietest periods, the knowledge that violence could arrive at any moment meant that true relaxation was almost impossible. Many soldiers turned to alcohol as a way of managing this anxiety, whatever they could get their hands on. Wine from French villages, vodka traded with Soviet troops, homemade brews of genuinely dangerous strength. Alcohol-related incidents became a serious and well-documented problem for virtually every army involved in the war. Sleep was another major and chronic issue. Even in the calmest periods between battles, proper sleep was nearly impossible to achieve. The constant threat of surprise attacks meant that soldiers slept lightly at best, always half listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. Combined with uncomfortable sleeping conditions, anxiety, and irregular schedules, chronic sleep deprivation became a near-universal experience. And then there was what soldiers began calling the thousand-yard stare, a particular look that appeared in the eyes of men who had been through too much, a kind of internal shutdown where a person would simply disconnect from everything around them. Sitting completely still, looking at nothing, responding to nothing. We now recognize this condition as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. But during World War II, there was almost no understanding of what it was, and even less support available for those who experienced it. Soldiers suffering from what was then called battle fatigue or shell shock were often simply told to rest and return to duty. The mental toll of the war, and of all that waiting and fear, lasted for many soldiers long after the fighting finally stopped. But here's something that the movies almost never show you. Something that gets left out of almost every account of the war. Sometimes, in rare and remarkable moments, soldiers on opposite sides of the conflict found ways to connect with each other. In Italy, there are several documented accounts of German and American soldiers who ended up sharing the same abandoned farmhouse during particularly brutal winter blizzards. Enemies, sleeping under the same roof, sharing what little food they had, and then returning to fighting each other the following morning. In some sectors, informal local ceasefires would develop, where both sides agreed without anyone giving any orders to simply not shoot at each other for a few hours. Soldiers also formed deep and genuine bonds with local animals. Almost every military unit in every army had some kind of unofficial mascot. Stray dogs and cats were the most common, but soldiers also adopted goats, foxes, and in at least a few remarkable cases, bears. The most famous example is Wojtek, a Syrian brown bear adopted by soldiers of the Polish Second Corps serving with the British Eighth Army. Wojtek became a genuine member of the unit, learned to carry artillery shells and ammunition crates by watching the soldiers around him, and was eventually officially enlisted as a private in the Polish army. He served until the end of the war and lived out the rest of his life in Edinburgh Zoo, visited regularly by the veterans who had served alongside him. And of course, the deepest and most lasting bonds of all formed between the soldiers themselves. Men from completely different backgrounds, different cities, different social classes, different everything, thrown together by circumstances entirely outside their control. Men who would never have met in any other situation, who became, through shared boredom and shared fear and shared waiting, closer to each other than to almost anyone else in their lives. Because when you spend weeks doing nothing together, waiting for something terrible that you cannot predict or control, you learn very quickly who people really are. So the next time you think about World War II, try to hold on to this. For every dramatic battle scene you have ever seen in a film or read about in a history book, there were days and weeks and sometimes months of soldiers just existing. Bored, scared, creative, lonely, human, playing cards in the mud, writing letters home by candlelight, carving chess pieces out of scraps of wood, falling asleep to the sound of a harmonica. War is many things. It is heroic and terrible and important and senseless, but it is also, more than almost anything else, a lot of waiting. If you found this interesting, subscribe to the channel. Every week we cover the hidden, forgotten, and genuinely surprising sides of history that never make it into the movies.